However, I'm thinking, now I'm beginning to wonder, the measures that were used for success, should probably not be related back to those earlier theories that required effectiveness, like team effectiveness. The closest we could get probably is some of the more current work that's being done on virtual teams. What are the properties of virtual teams? Okay, and what are their measures of effectiveness or success? And you might find a little stronger support in the literature, and that would probably be a minor redo in terms of some of that way you could tie it together a little bit more. But that was, it was like pulling teeth for you, and I really, I sympathized because so much of that literature did not inform what he found. This is a different beast altogether, it seems, or it strikes me. Again, I'm not so intimately involved in this as several of you here are, but it strikes me that it's so significantly different that we perhaps need a different theory to explain it. One that's either more inclusive, from a sociological or an organizational perspective, or we simply say, well, like Starbucks says, it's so different, we don't even have means of teaching it right now because we haven't defined it properly. If you can't define it, how can you measure it? If you can't measure it, then how the heck can you really, ultimately develop a theory about it? So we're all tied up in this this mess here. I can understand some of the issues, for example, on the operational history, that I think something was said earlier about self-directed. There's a whole literature on self-directed organizations, SDO. Emergent, yes, self-directed. And again, that's back in the organizational literature that might give you some further insights as to why this didn't pan out for you. Similarly, when I think about leader centrality, I think that there are properties sometimes of the way the task is organized that is so highly structured that it makes the use of leadership, if you will, leader centrality, relegated to next to useless. In other words, it's called the substitutes for leadership area. And task structurability is one of those substitutes for leadership. Okay, so
which is what you guys are talking about.
Right.
just
In org language.
in org language.
Right.
The problem is we're all speaking in different tongues. It's easy to translate these various tongues, right?
And we're expecting you to.
So could we call that a platform?
A mediator.
That's a good term.
Okay, I have a couple of process issues, and I can either do that before or after.
Could I address what you said, David? I think
Try to
it's important.
clarify,
Let me make sure
first.
I'm understanding. That, and of course, back in the XB, there was question the idea of using effectiveness and can we really relate a team to an open source community. And back then, actually, we were looking at the team effectiveness being just the output measures, how much software was produced. So that's kind of that first part of what you're saying, that's the effort part. But since then, what's happened is we've added in activity. So activity is how many downloads, how many page views. And what I would argue is that in some respects, these project communities are really little markets. Because if you think about it, and let's relate it to a software development team. If you were to say, what's an effective software development team? Well, if I understand right, effectiveness, typically you go to the leader and say, was this effective? And basically, based on certain criteria, that's a typical way to measure effectiveness of a team. Software teams produce software, open source communities produce software, sometimes the same. You couldn't even tell the difference. So, what determines an effective software development team? Well, I would think it's how the quality of that software, how well it's accepted, would be key measures, right? So, in the case of open source communities, as before in the XP, we just stopped at the output. Now we extend it to activity, and I would argue that that activity is actually a response of the market, of kind of the immediate market in terms of what's happening. So, it might be misleading the way I put it up there, because there I'm talking about these really broad, long-term kind of market impacts, Linux, for example, is now an industry standard. You know, and these are things that have so many other factors involved: strategy, structure of the computer industry, and so forth. But if you look at each one of these projects, I would say, you know, they really are a mini market. And to the extent that activity is generated, and you see higher levels of activity, I think that is a measure of effectiveness. I think it's saying that this software must have been good enough because these volunteers have come and they've downloaded it, and there have been page views, and there's activity that was resulting from that. So I would say I think we have at least gone to the second level. I think we do capture that. It would be good to go on, I agree with you. But in some respects, that was also our study design, because if you take too big of a picture here and try to bite off too much, so many other factors get involved that, you know, you really maybe can't even sort out what's happening. So when we limit it to that 2 years, we're limiting some of these really long-term impacts, but I do think we are seeing things that are at least roughly corresponding to effectiveness in teams. And again, if you think of a software development team versus a software development community, I think what we're measuring probably correlates fairly well with if you went to the head of a software development team and asked about effectiveness.
Okay, but
These are
let's,
probably the things that they would talk about.
let's say then that we're okay with the measure, but then why are the findings so counterintuitive to what the literature would
Well,
tell us?
Well, because I think this is fundamentally different. Even though you create the same software, it's a fundamentally different process. And that is reflected in the kinds of networks that support it. So I think there's no simple, easy answer to point to it, but I think that I believe is the answer. It is fundamentally different. I don't think it's in the measures. I think it's yes.
In the literature